Welcome, everyone, to an edition of Governed by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and government. My name is Eric Leupold. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. So, if you listened to the previous episode, I talked about administrative law and how the government has expanded its power, and that this is not a recipe for liberty, but actually for tyranny. Now, on today's episode, I wanted to kind of narrow in and look at the government's involvement in charity or nation building and trying to help others, specifically looking at USAID and other such organizations or programs. And so to address that topic, I had the opportunity to interview Luisa Rodriguez, who is a friend of mine, a fellow Christian, and someone who has had extensive experience in foreign missions, as well as working with and for the government, and who has seen the effects of government intervention or help, so to speak, in person. And so I thought that hearing about her firsthand experience would be very useful and helpful. And so I hope that you enjoyed the conversation. All right, well, Luisa, thank you for joining me today on the podcast to have a good conversation on government programs, U.S. aid, things of that sort. We've known each other for a long time, gone to church together, small group. But I know that you've had experience working with the government or in the government as well, and even in other countries, and seeing how government programs kind of how they actually work out in practice. So before we kind of dive into that, though, if you could please just share a little bit about who you are, what you do, and your experience with the government.
Okay. Well, Eric, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But yeah, so I worked for, I was hired by the Navy almost straight out of college. So I worked with them for 8 years. And because I was a civilian, I always like to say I wasn't owned by them, so I could quit whenever I wanted to.
Yeah.
But through that, I got the opportunity to travel. So yeah, I traveled to, through the military, I traveled to Panama. Before that, though, in preparation for the job that I wanted to have, I did an internship with the U.S. Embassy in Nicaragua. So I did that for a summer. I also got a scholarship to do like a research study in Guatemala. So the college paid me to go to Guatemala and kind of like do research for my thesis at the time, which was the reintegration of the guerrillas after the Civil War ended. And then I also did an exchange program in Bolivia. And I was able to use my embassy contacts from Nicaragua to help me in Bolivia for a project that I was working on. And it's then that I met actually an employee from USAID. It was actually, I stayed at her house for a little bit. So very nice, very, very nice person. So that's kind of what I did that's my experience in the government. My relevant experience now pertaining to this conversation is I work part-time for a ministry that operates in Guatemala and at the border in Texas. So I travel to Guatemala a few times a year, and we work in a community, hands-on work with the poorest of the poor, mostly children and women. But so I've learned a lot from the humanitarian side, from like the charity side, doing that the last couple of years.
Yeah. Okay. No, very nice. That's a lot of experience right there. A lot more than many people that I know. And what I think is important about that is that I think a lot of times when it comes to programs, especially with the government, the idea of the program, it sounds really good on paper, and maybe it has a lot of resources and energy behind it. But then, what you want to do and what ends up actually happening are not always the same thing. And so a lot of times I think that people need to see what's actually happening in the real world in order to assess, okay, is this actually working or not? And so, the reason why I want to have you on is because recently, you and I have both seen on the news and on social media with friends, fellow Christians, non-Christians, with what Elon Musk is doing with Doge and kind of the cutting or the exposure or the criticism of a lot of the government aid programs, particularly U.S. aid. There's a lot of feelings on both sides, and even among Bible-believing Christians, for example, there's a lot of disagreement as far as like, well, it's wrong to cut those things. They're doing really good work. It's so important, and if to cut those things is to really hurt those countries, especially after God has blessed us. So, and I'm kind of talking about this from a Christian perspective. A non-Christian might see it a little differently, and so you wrote an article recently talking about this, addressing this topic, and bringing some, I think, really good insights into that. You shared about some of your own experiences, and so for those who haven't read your article, and I'll direct them to your article, make sure that there's a link in the notes and whatnot. But what are some of the major points that you brought out in your article that you think people should really pay attention to?
Yeah. So I'll back up a little bit and tell you why I wrote the article to begin with. So I keep up with the Guatemalan newspaper for various reasons. One's I'm there often, so I want to see what the crime levels are, right? See what's going on. Yeah. But it's Prensa Libre. And the article came out about how much money USAID had given to Guatemala, which was 2.4 billion over 20 years, right? And so I was curious as to how Guatemalans felt about it. So I started reading the comments. Now, mind you, the same newspaper published an article about immigration and Trump policy, and I went to the comments, and it was like scathing criticism of President Trump and about the deportations, and immigration's a huge issue in Guatemala. So I was like, okay, well, are they going to be criticizing the fact that aid has been frozen to Guatemala from USAID? And it didn't surprise me, and it really confirmed what I know to be true just from experience of working in the region, is that people were either indifferent to the US cutting aid, or they were upset that so much had been given and there was little to show for it. So like there was one comment I found a little bit comical, but they were like, wow, with 2.4 billion, like we should have like, a high-speed train system like all over Guatemala at this point. But people in Guatemala, Guatemalans know that corruption is a huge problem. And so they know, and the comments reflected it, that whatever money is being funneled in, very little of it is actually going to the people that need it. It's going into the hands of corrupt officials. And that was the primary point of my article. Like there's a lot of good intentions, but where was, like, is the money actually going to the individuals that need it? And are the programs actually being effective? And then from a Christian perspective, I didn't write this in the article, but some of that money went to fund an LGBTQ organization in Guatemala. And Guatemala is an incredibly conservative country. Interesting. Like very, very conservative. And of course, there is a group in Guatemala, but most Guatemalans wouldn't approve of that kind of funding going. I would venture to say something like 99.9% of Guatemalans would not approve of that kind of funding for that type of organization, especially when you have kids that are starving. So
some points I wanted to kind of follow up with that there. Yeah, so you have the one issue with regards to an ideology that the government is trying to put behind its money. I think I would say it's naive to think that money is kind of neutral or that funding is neutral, and it's kind of rare to see any situation where a person or a group is giving money and they just kind of say do whatever you want with it, no strings attached, kind of thing. That's rare in my experience. Um, and so when the government is doing that, I imagine that they're advocating for a particular way of thinking, ideology, worldview, whatever you want to call it. So, and if the worldview is contrary to what we consider to be good and true and beautiful, then that's a problem. But
Mhm.
so that's kind of the more the I guess the ideological issue. But then on the practical side of things, and I think this is where a lot of people don't think it through. Um, when you say like it's not getting to the people, it's not doing the thing that it's supposed to be doing, or there's a lot of corruption. Like, how does that happen? How is could you can you shed some light on in your experience, like how does that happen where the money just never gets to the thing? Like, what is happening along the way that the money is just it's just going somewhere else? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so like to provide a specific example, I was actually vacationing in Guatemala,
Hmm.
and I was hiking, and I like to talk to people, and so there was he was the guard for an Airbnb, like a huge, beautiful Airbnb property, and so we just started talking and we
Hmm.
started chatting, and I don't know how we got to the subject, but he told me that his um the city that he's the town, been a town, like a small town that he was from, got funding. I don't remember if it was USAID. It might have been the European government. I don't know where the funding came from, but I just know that it was supposed to be for infrastructure
Hmm.
for the town. And he was telling me how the mayor ended up paying, it got funneled through the mayor, right? Because he's the one that's going to decide like where the money needs to go.
Hmm.
And then he ended up paying his relatives to
Oh.
do the work. And so the actual work that was done was very minimal. There was hardly anything that actually went to the town. It just ended up going into the pockets of all his family members.
Hmm.
So when you have a culture that where corruption's commonplace, like here in the United States, you would never think about bribing a police officer
Hmm.
if you get a speeding ticket, right? Like that's not common for us.
Hmm.
And if you do, you're probably going to end up getting in big trouble for doing so, right?
Yeah.
Places like Guatemala in Latin America, you can bribe.
Hmm.
You can bribe the police officer to get out of a ticket that's like would be commonplace, or you bribe this person. Corruption is just like so ingrained in the political
Hmm.
system. And so when you have an organization like USAID, right? And if it's going to be channeled through government organizations to nonprofits, like the amount that's actually, once it gets funneled through all these people and it finally ends up in the hands of um, the individuals, what they get, the people that need it, is very, very, very small. And so you don't always know who you can trust,
Hmm.
government or even like non-government. Like we learned the hard way for our organization, and I'm talking about the ministry, right?
Okay.
So we had two individuals that we thought we could trust, who were caretakers of the property that we have, that we rent out. It's a property that we rent out to host volunteers, and this is where they come and stay. And one day when we were left and they were left by themselves, they took up, they stole equipment, video equipment. They completely disappeared off the face of the earth. And these were like supposed Christian individuals that I hugged. They gave me hugs. They cooked me a meal, and then they just stole from the ministry
Hmm.
and a lot of the things that they were given. So it's so you see corruption on both ends. So the idea that having worked for the government, I can tell you, like, it is, and you would know this too, it is incredibly inefficient. And there is so much waste
Hmm.
to begin with because the bureaucracy is so big and there's so many people involved. And
Hmm.
now you pair that up and you're channeling that through a culture and a political system that has high levels of corruption. I mean,
Hmm.
common sense would tell you that what's actually going to get to the people is not going to be much of anything.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. Yeah, I've experienced. I mean, at least from the government inefficiency perspective, can very much attest to things like that. I mean, and everyone knows. I think deep down in their heart of hearts, they know that the government's inefficient. I mean, it was just a common thing, and it always is that way. I mean, in the military, it's the fiscal year's coming up. We have this much money to spend, and if we don't spend it, we won't get the same amount next year. So, if and this was the case years ago when I was in Florida, but hey, we have all these extra, rounds of ammunition, grenade launchers, M4, whatever. We need to shoot this ammunition so that we can get the same amount next year. So I was given the opportunity to, and I'm not even a security forces person. I'm just a pilot, and I was able to, have fun emptying clips of ammunition in the range for no particular reason except that it needed to be shot to get done. And then that's just the inefficiency point. But like you said about just the corruption and how when the money is passing through so many hands, and that money doesn't belong to that person. The money came from somewhere else, predominantly the taxpayers. And so I think that when you're handling someone else's money, the temptation is to not, I guess, be as accountable or to have as much care for it. And so, because it's not really any skin off your back. You're only really afraid of getting caught if someone holding you accountable. But if no one's holding you accountable, then what's going to happen to that money, and just how many wickets it has to go through just to get to a town in Guatemala.
right.
So yeah, I'm always reminded of the proverb. I forget which chapter verse it is, but it's the fallow ground of the poor would yield much food, but it is swept away through injustice. And I just think
Mm.
that proverb from scriptures is so powerful because I think it just summarizes everything. Like, God has provided so much land, so many resources, and even a small patch of land could be fruitful and productive, but the predominant reason why it is not is injustice. It's not because God has not provided the resources, the land, the animals, and things like that.
Yeah.
Um,
It's injustice, but it's also there's a lot of like good intentions behind programs, but they don't take into account either the culture or the attitudes of people or their habits. So I think like in the article I gave the example of as part of my education, I had to go live with an indigenous family in the plateau. So this is a very, very poor family in a very poor village. They had gotten their first light bulb, like literally like a week before I got there, and they had no running water. So they had to go get water, and it was by our standards, it was pretty poor conditions. And so there was an aid organization. Again, I don't remember if it was USAID or if it was the Peace Corps that had come through, but they had set up outhouses for them to use because they didn't have running water, they don't have plumbing, they don't have. So it seems like a great idea,
yeah.
right? Like, wow, this is wonderful. It doesn't require plumbing, and they had all these outhouses on town, but they were like brand spanking new. And I was told that they'd been there for a while. But they look new because nobody used them. Nobody in the town used them. And so the kids, I'd be playing with the kids and they would like have to go one or number two. It didn't matter. And wherever they were, they would just like pull their pants down and do number one or number two. And like the women, I remember wanting to go for a walk. There was another American also being hosted by another family in the town, and she and I wanted to go for a walk. And the moms thought it was weird that we wanted to go for a walk just for a stroll, but they didn't want to let us go by ourselves, so they went with us. And so we're walking, and the mom had to go to the bathroom. One of them, I don't remember which one, and she just right there on the road. Now they have these like beautiful poofy skirts, and so you couldn't see anything.
Mhm.
So it gave them privacy, but it was right there on the road. So the intention is great. I mean, they say the outhouses saved my life because I got really sick, right?
Oh,
So they were great for the Americans that would, but this isn't like a touristy town or anything.
yeah.
Anyway, right? But other than myself and my friend, there was nobody else using the outhouses.
Hmm.
So that's kind of an example of putting money towards something. It seems like a great idea, but if there's nobody to stay and educate and mentor and show them why this is a good idea, it's money wasted.
Yeah, so did nobody talk to them and explain to them what these outhouses were for? Did that just not happen?
I'm
Really?
sure there was some explanation, but
Hmm.
when you have years of habits, you're not going to break a habit from one day
Yeah.
to the other. So, like in Guatemala, in the town that we're working in, like we can go in there and give them a talk that'll last 2 hours, and it's going to go through one ear and go out the other. Like the town has, we set up a recycling program, and the town has cleaned up a lot.
Mhm.
Like it's very visible how much cleaner it is now. It's not a town, it's like a little like neighborhood. It has 630 families.
Hmm.
But we started a program where the entrance fee for any event were 5 plastic bottles of any kind. And so at first they were very reluctant to pick up the garbage because it was very embarrassing.
Oh.
But um just culturally it just felt like, I guess it's okay to throw garbage but not okay to pick it up, right? um but they got used to it. But we've been there now for, I've been working with New Vision in Guatemala maybe 2 years now, but they've been there for 5. So you're working with the same neighborhood, the
Hmm.
same families, the
Hmm.
same people, day in and day out. You are educating the kids, you're mentoring the teenagers, you're mentoring the women. Like it's a process. It takes work. And now
Mhm.
they're comfortable. Now it's like commonplace for them to come in with their 5 bottles. And we hold contests. Like the kid with the most gets to pick, more, a couple or more toys from the prize box than
Hmm.
some of the other kids. So we've had kids like bring in like 400 bottles, plastic bottles. So, but it takes work and it takes being present. Like you can't just come in, throw money at something and
Mhm.
expect that the people are going to know what to do with it.
Hmm.
And as a ministry, we have learned that lesson, and we're learning as we continue to work with the people of Santa Rosita. Santa Rosita is the name of the little neighborhood that we work in. But like when we first came in, we installed biostoves. It's one of the things that we do.
Hmm.
They're great. They're amazing because it uses the fuel that they're used to using, which is wood.
Mhm.
So they continue to use wood, but now there's an exhaust system
Huh.
where before the smoke would build up in a little house. So you go into these little kitchens and they're all charred black.
Oh.
But not, yeah, but not with the biostoves. There's an exhaust system, and there's a plancha, which is like a flat surface, so they can make tortillas. So we love the stoves, but when we first started installing them, like we realized some of the people were selling them. And so now, so we've learned our lesson, like we have to monitor we require a certain amount of community hours for anybody that gets a stove. And if not, we'll go in there and take the stove back.
Hmm.
But it's just sort of it's things that we've learned being involved in that same community. But now, like, I mean, I think we have a pretty good system now, and the people like really look forward to getting the stoves, whoever's on the list next. Our goal is to get every family in there a bio stove.
Hmm.
But like I said, it takes mentoring, it takes work, it takes actually being involved. And so I think some of these programs with, there's a lot of good intention, but what actually happens is different. And yes, and it might be channeled through some charitable organizations in Guatemala. It's just hard to tell which ones are good and which ones are not. Just because it's charitable, just because it's Christian, doesn't mean that they're necessarily having a great impact. Or are the costs going more administratively to pay people salaries and less towards the people? And sometimes these organizations get too big for their own good. Like on a personal level, I'm not going to name names, but I pulled my money out of like some huge these are Christian organizations that operate worldwide, because now that I'm involved in this field and I've met people that have been on the ground in the different countries where these organizations are supposed to be working, you realize that in some places, yes, it's working, but in other places, it's not. The money isn't, it's just too big. When it's too big, you can't control what's happening locally. And so I've redirected my own charitable giving towards mostly, except Samaritan's Purse. I love Samaritan's Purse. Like I've just like regularly see them doing a good job when it comes to disaster relief. But most of our charitable giving has been redirected to local, like smaller organizations that work very locally.
You bring up a lot of good points there, Luisa. I completely see the point regarding the size of an organization. I mean, I think we all kind of get that, because we see like big corporations, the Walmarts or Amazon or whatever. And when something gets so large, there are so many levels, whether it's, upper middle management, supervisors and da. And so it's very hard, it would seem, for the people at the top, the leaders, to really know what's going on in the actual field there in real life. And so it does make sense that a smaller, more intimate organization can, in a sense, be more efficient. And then the other point that I've seen in what you're saying here is, like, I was thinking of discipleship, and I was thinking of, when you're trying to help anybody, and this could be in any situation, as a Christian, we're called to make disciples. Okay. So we see individuals that are not living for the Lord. They're living in sin. They don't know about the Lord. Okay. Well, of course we want to see them saved, and then we want to disciple them so that they stop living that sinful lifestyle and they start living for the Lord. And you can't just solve that problem or do that in, a 2-hour seminar or whatever. It does need to be relational, that mentorship, that you come alongside someone and maybe they're struggling with addiction of some kind, or they're struggling with financial management, and they need someone to kind of explain, this is what you're doing that's not healthy, it's not good. And then this is what the Bible says, like, this is the right way to do it. And here, let me help you and give you some accountability so that you start to cultivate new habits and new ways of thinking that can kind of break the old sinful tendencies. And I think that is true on an individual level and in a large-scale group level, like helping another town, village, country, or whatever. And I think that that's what we're kind of missing. We're not really thinking about that when we want to just help people. We just want to. You see the poor person on the street, the beggar, right? And generally speaking, it's not wise to just give people money. The homeless, just give them money. I mean, how many times have I been told that, like, the tendency might be that they will use it to buy drugs? Like, you cannot just give them money. You have to disciple them. You have to come alongside of them and provide a different kind of relationship service there.
Yeah, I kind of see like to actually help someone, it takes a lot of, it does. It takes discipleship. It takes work. And what I enjoy about going to Guatemala is I see the same people over and over again, the
Mm-hmm.
same kids, the same women. We're giving them the gospel because if there isn't a heart change, the community isn't. We want to see the community prosper financially. We want to see them, be able to have infrastructure like running water and economically for them to do well. But if there isn't a heart change, that's not going to happen. If you still have these old habits and these old way of thinking, like for example, with girls, generally this particular community does not value education. And part of it is because they are living in poverty. And so when you need to feed your family, do I send my 14-year-old boy to school where he doesn't earn money? Or do I send him to work
Mm-hmm.
so we can, so from a practical reason, I understand where it's coming from. But there isn't that, like sometimes I see in Asian culture, like this huge emphasis on education, like education, education, education. You don't
Mm-hmm.
find that a lot in Santa Rosita, for example. But in addition to that, if they can only send one person to school, it will be the boys. It will be the boy over the girl. So the girls even much less have this idea. They don't grow up with this idea that they're going to get much out of education. And so one of the things that we promote, obviously, is education, education, education. And we give them scholarships so that they don't have to spend, even though that's public school, they still have to have uniforms. Uniforms are required in public schools in Guatemala, and they have to have all their supplies. So we provide scholarship for kids to be able to have their uniforms and supplies. But that's an attitude that's going to take time to change for them to value education and to know that their kids will have a better future, and they will have a better future if they will just get educated. We have a lot of women in the community who don't know how to read and write. So like I said, it's work, but it's work here too. I mean, there are organizations that I give money to because I can't be in every place, right?
Yeah.
But if I want to make a change in someone's life, I have to be willing to open my door and give them time. So in addition to money, if they may need it, right, you have to give people time. And I think that's the one thing as American Christians, we're selfish with our time. And so like, well, my kids have this and I got this going on and I got this other thing. And so I don't have time to see somebody. I don't have time to mentor. But opening your home to people that need it, being willing to mentor and give people their time, that's what creates attitude change. And you create like accountability in people. Like there's a young woman that came to live with Julia and I when my daughters Emma and Leah were really small, and she was coming out of a really bad situation, but she wanted to change her life. We had her with us for 6 months. And it was hard. It was hard for us. It was hard for her because she'd never had any structure. She was like 19, 20. She was very young in her life. It was very difficult. But she ended up going to Moody after staying with us. And then after she graduated from Moody, she came back. And then we had to like forcefully have her move on so she wouldn't create a dependence. And then, but we continued to be present in her life. And now she's married, she has kids, she's doing so well. But, and there were a lot of people, it wasn't just us. So I don't want to
Sure. No.
There were a lot of people that were involved in her life, but is that willingness are you going to give people the time? Are you going to open your doors to people? And I think that's what we're most selfish with.
That really brings up a thought in my mind because, I mean, I think you nailed it. Because I think a lot of us think, or we fail to consider that time is also a resource. Resource is money, of course, but time is almost, it's finite. We're not getting any more of it. We all have a certain amount of time. And I think maybe in some sense, I think either deep down, I wouldn't say it's necessarily maliciously or on purpose. Now, maybe it is the case for some people that they would rather just buy someone off. They would just pay their money or give their money, and that would make them feel good in their own mind. Like, hey, I did a good deed. I'm fine, and then they can go about their business, spending their time however they want to. So I'm sure there are people that feel that way and do that on purpose. But then I imagine, it's also a very subtle thing where, someone is demanding something from us, and it is very tempting to just give them, quote unquote, quick fix so that I won't be burdened by it. And it's not that we hate the person or don't love the person or don't care about them, but we're just not thinking about how time is probably more important of a resource than money. Both are necessary, but ultimately it's time that has more value, it would seem, right, in the long run. And that kind of ties in kind of with my next question, or want to get your thoughts on, is the role of the civil government or the federal government in doing these things, because it's pretty clear that the government has so many other things to be doing and never has enough money anyways. I cannot imagine that they're able to provide the time and the relationship that's needed to have long-lasting real change. So the government just cannot do that. It's just so inefficient, so big, and so focused on multitude of other things. So it seems inefficient to just, kind of like, let the government handle it, and then I don't have to be burdened with it as an individual person, because they're going to fix the problem themselves. And I just, as a Christian, I want to push back against that and say, well, the answer is not giving the government that responsibility, because it's just not going to do it well, and it's not going to actually fix the problem. And so even though there are many Christians that I know that they mean well, and they want the government to do all these things, and in their mind that is the loving thing to do. But I just want to get your thoughts on, like, how would you kind of try to convince Christians or maybe respond to Christians about that there's a better way?
Yeah. I think you nailed it. When we leave it in the hands of the government, we're absolving ourselves as the church from doing that work. Scripturally, what has been modeled for us. So yes, we have discipleship, right? Jesus modeled that for us. He spent 3 years discipling the 12 disciples. Mm-hmm. So that's one avenue. But also, so what do the scriptures say about government? And what do the scriptures say of how are you supposed to be taking care of the poor? So most of the commandments, per se, whether in the Old Testament and the New Testament, are really directed towards like the individual. But when they're not, how did Israel, for example, take care of the poor in the Old Testament? Like, how was it done? It was through the temple system, right? So the laws that God had dictated, there was, I don't remember which tithes they were, but the excess of some of the tithes were to be given to the poor. And that was administered by the Levites. Mm-hmm. So that is the temple spiritual system of the country. I can find no example where it actually came out of the monarchy's treasury. Like, I can't find one where that was the case. It was either from the temple system or from gleaning, and right? Mm-hmm. So individuals, the poor, had the right to glean from your individual property. Mm-hmm. So what do we find in the New Testament? We're supposed to take care of each other. We're supposed to take care of those that need the individual. What are God's instructions to like civil government? I don't remember. I know you know it really well, the exact, verse, but it's really provide security, keep the population safe. That's the role of the civil government.
Yep.
So the example, what was modeled for us in the Old Testament, and the example that we have in the New Testament is in the New Testament, it's the church. It's our responsibility. So in the early church, when you had Christians who would pick up the babies that were thrown out to die because they didn't want them, it's Christians who took those babies home and took care of them, right? They provided their time and their resources. Now they have an extra mouth to feed. It's very personable. When we give to the poor, it should be personal. Like we should be face to face. And I'm not saying like don't give to international organizations, but give to international organizations that are personal, that they're working with the individuals like day in and day out, mentoring, helping, so that the money doesn't go to waste and it actually produces fruit and it produces a heart change. And then you don't know. This is like, unfortunately, the way our government has, like, it was founded on Christian principles, but we've seen how it's like started to go in an opposite direction. We don't know what their agenda is.
Yeah.
So if our tax dollars are going to organizations like USAID, well, what's the agenda in the end? Does it align with Christian values? We still live in a system where we have a voice and we could say, I agree with this or I don't agree with this. And so like for me personally, like if the funds are frozen from USAID, like that's okay. But I would call the Christian church to step in.
Yes.
Because it's our job. It's our job. Like it's our job in our communities. It's our job. Like for me, I'm originally from Guatemala, so I have a connection to the people of Guatemala. It's my job to go there. And in full disclosure, I work part-time for the ministry, so I do earn an income from it. But even before I worked for the ministry, like I would take Emma and Leah, my daughter is like for 4-6 weeks at a time, and we would go work at the border and volunteer our time. And Leah would be putting beans in little bags, and she would complain that she'd been working for hours only after like 5 minutes of doing it, but at the end of the day, like I see that, like to help the poor, to take care of your neighbors, that's my responsibility. It's not the government's responsibility. And if the government's going to do it, they're going to do a really bad job at it. And if they're not going to do it, that's fine, because we should be doing it.
Yeah.
That's the way I see it.
No, that's fair. I mean, and I think scripture, like you said, it reinforces this regularly. I was thinking of the Apostle Paul when there was a famine in Jerusalem. He's going around to Gentile churches, asking for collections, and he's not saying, write to your Roman senator or to Caesar and have them raise the taxes so that the government can take care of the famine in Jerusalem. No, Paul's like, well, we're going to take up a collection here, and the Gentile Christians are going to help the Jews that are having a famine in Israel. And again, it's not the government's job to do that. And as a Christian myself, like, to me, it's like a no-brainer, because so two options. Like, would I rather just have less taxes taken from me, and then I can select which organizations I want to help? I can use discernment, and I can figure out which ones are the most responsible. And, since it is my money that I'm giving away, I have a vested interest in not throwing it away and not putting it behind really, really bad organizations or inefficient organizations. So I'd rather have that situation than the government takes my money and it just tells me that it's going to use my money for good purposes, but ultimately I don't really know which organization it's giving it to and its motive behind it. Like, I'm not doing the homework because the government says it's going to do it for me. So I would certainly just rather just the government let us keep our money, and then we can use it for good purposes, and then the right organizations are getting the support that they need, rather than these, inefficient or corrupt or ideologically wrong organizations there. So to me, it's a no-brainer. But I'm just trying to figure out ways like how we can kind of exhort our fellow Christians to think more carefully and biblically about these things. So any other thoughts to add to that, Luisa?
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely agree with everything you said. And there are great Christian organizations out there doing a lot of great work. Like, if you want to support, like if you feel, oh no, like this aid isn't going to get to these people, well, then look for, as a Christian, right? We can't speak for non-Christians. Then look for organizations in the areas or the things that you're interested in. Research them and give to those organizations. They're going to do a lot better job. And you're going to see a lot more impact. And there are, like, just like here in Illinois, there's a tattoo artist. He for free, he covers up the brandings of human trafficking victims.
Wow.
And gang members. It seems like a simple thing, but it's huge for that community, for those that have been trafficked or those that have been gang members, to be able to physically remove the brandings. He repurposes, like he draws something else, so it's no longer the whatever the branding marker was. I think they're called Ink 180. They're here in Illinois. He does amazing work. There's another one that I've heard about in Nepal. There's a U.S. company that's funding a lot of their work, but this, I believe it is a Christian organization in Nepal, and they're building a building right now to house trafficking victims that they pull out of the trafficking networks. And so they're doing great work. And this is just stuff I've heard from people that have come to, who have served in Guatemala or who have served with us in Laredo, and the things that they have seen. So there are a lot of great organizations out there doing a lot of great work. And I know locally we have so many. I know our church supports a lot of foster children, pro-life organizations, and like food pantries. Like our local church has a food pantry, but they don't just give food away. They share the gospel, they disciple. It's the same volunteers that go there and work with the people that come in and day out. And that's what we want. So there's so much better use of our money. And I wouldn't see that like, oh no, like this I see it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity where we can help out more. If there's a need that we feel like, oh no, USAID is no longer going to be able to help, well then we can step in and help.
I think it's as simple as that. I agree. And I know that, this conversation has been great and eye-opening to me in many ways, just hearing the experiences that you've had and your knowledge on this. But since we are pushing up on our time here, I just wanted to end by just having you, if you could, for those who are listening that might not be familiar with your work, I know you write regularly. And so, where can people read some of the things that you've written, follow you, and do you have any other final words that you wanted to share?
Yeah. Well, thank you. So all my so I write political articles from a Christian perspective. Those can be found at Medium, and it's at the at Luisa F. Rodriguez. And then for like my Bible research, biblicalwarfare.com, that's just all my study on warfare and warriors and spies in the Bible. And then fruitfullywoman.com is my research on women
Hmm.
in the Bible. So those are the 3 ways. But yeah, just again, thank you for having me. And I just hope, like, for any Christian that's listening, that they're not. I would just hope they're not discouraged by what they're seeing, because at the end of the day, God wants to move through the church. He
Yeah.
moves through the church, and we are his hands and feet here. And for me, like I said before, it's just an opportunity. And so just see it. If your heart feels really like ripped apart by what's going on, we'll use that energy and find a place
Hmm.
where you can help. And that's, yeah.
No, thank you. I'll make sure to get those links into the notes for the show. But again, Luisa, thank you for coming on the show today. And maybe in the future we'll have another topic of conversation to touch on.
All right. Sounds great. Thank you, Eric.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation. And I think that there was more that we could talk about, but I believe that we highlighted the main points that we need to consider regarding government involvement in helping other people. I mean, there are just so many factors here that limit the effectiveness of government help or assistance. So I hope that you'll consider these things. These topics are not going to go away anytime soon, but we need to think through them as Christians and advocate for those policies that will really help rather than make the problem worse. So with that, until next time, take care and God bless.